I'm feeling it. You know, it's tense up here. I'm feeling tense. I can feel it.
Oh my god, my flashlight went off. Oh my god, my flashlight's blinking.
Who's down here with me? I got chills all over my body right now. Holy Whatever this negative energy is, push me! Push me down these steps!
Hello and welcome to the Ghost Addicts Podcast, dedicated to everyone who is addicted to the paranormal. Thanks for tuning in with us. Tonight's discussion is about the former West Virginia State Penitentiary in Moundsville, West Virginia. My name is Jason.
Hey there, Jason. This is Ryan. How is everyone doing tonight?
Hi, guys. I'm Dave.
And I'm Steve, taking up the rear.
As Jason said, tonight we are discussing the former West Virginia Penitentiary in Moundsville, a location that we have all been very close to over the years and we've become very, very much attached to because of the history, because of the ghosts, because of our paranormal experiences that we've had there. I mean, this place just draws you in. It pulls you in from the moment you walk through the door, and I think it doesn't let you go.
That's very true, and I think we are one of the only groups, and I know we say it every time, but I think we are one of the only groups who can say that we all met in prison.
That's very true. I mean, I'm not sure exactly what we did to get in there to begin with, but I'm sure we deserved it.
When was the first time that you guys were there? I'm pretty sure the first time I was there was in 2001, so it's been a long time coming.
Well, I remember the first time that I really set foot inside the West Virginia Penitentiary was really in 2008, and I think that was really around the time that all of us started to congregate together and really meet one another. Was around 2008, 2009. But what about you, Steve? When was the first time that you set foot in that building?
Well, starting tours, when I started working as a tour guide there, right around 2006, 2007.
Awesome.
I remember that it was shortly after that I actually first set foot in the building, about 3 months or so after I first started hanging out at that old penitentiary, that Jason decided to come on an overnight investigation, and I think that was the first time that I had met Jason. And Jason, do you remember that night?
I do, actually. I remember it still today like it was yesterday, to be honest. I believe that was a cold night in February of 2009, and like you say, it's the first time I met you.
So, guys, how do we even begin to start telling this 10 to 20 year story of all of our time here at the penitentiary?
Maybe go over what we feel, looking back, what really drew us into the prison.
I think that's a good idea, because if you look at that building as a whole, I mean, as I'd said, the building itself just draws you in, and that's from an aesthetic point of view, from the archaeological magnetism of the building, the Gothic structure, the interesting history behind the building. But it's interesting because, as we had said before, it was like we all met in prison. That building drew us together. It was like this cosmic catalyst that drew us all in, and really has kept us ever since. We have yet to leave that place willingly, and I don't think we ever will leave that place willingly. It definitely has a place in all of our hearts, and I think all of us are very drawn to the location, to the building, to the spirits of the building, because don't get us wrong, that is one of the most haunted places in America, and it holds more spirits than really a lot of other places we've investigated. It's in the top 10, in the top 5 at least, most haunted places we've investigated.
Especially when the location was literally nicknamed Blood Alley by the Department of Justice. I mean, that's a documented 998 deaths on 10 acres of property. That alone right there is a key element to a location, having paranormal activity.
Absolutely. You look at the former West Virginia Penitentiary in its earliest years, and it really was an experimentation of a state in its infancy, trying to establish a state prison in an area that had yet to have such an institution, such an establishment, and to try and incorporate different methods of corrections, especially one as violent as the Auburn method of corrections, which was all about hard manual labor and even torture and violence and beatings and floggings and just very, very violent treatment of the inmates from the very beginning. That's the 19th century, 1866 to 99 they were building that prison. A lot of the documentation was lost, and the only thing we have to go with as far as history goes is the newspaper articles and interviews that people wrote. And I remember reading one that stuck with me to this day, is that an inmate actually said that he would not wish the West Virginia Penitentiary on his worst enemy.
The warden, or back then as they would call him, the superintendent, was John Peck. And it was reported in a interview November 30th, 1886. It was called Under the Lash. It was in the Cincinnati Enquirer. The person who was being interviewed, his last name was Wilkerson, and he was the assistant superintendent who actually quit his job to expose what was going on during that time frame between 1885 to 1887. And he went on to say in the interview, when he was asked what all went on during the mistreatment of the inmates per se, he said what went on there would make the Spanish Inquisition look a mere child's play in comparison. Two of the main forms of quote-unquote punishment, what we would normally call torture, that were used were the kicking jenny and the shoe fly. The shoe fly, roundabout, just flat out saying it, the individual, the inmate, was put into a rack and pinion. He could not move his body. He could not pivot or move his neck in any direction. And he was waterboarded. And to the point where some were driven insane if they survived. Many were actually drowned. Many actually died from the treatment of the shoe fly. The other device that was used was called the kicking jenny. The kicking jenny basically was a half-arc apparatus on a frame, more than likely like an iron frame, and the individual, the inmate, was stood at the decline end of the arc, which would come up to about waist level, and they would take the inmate's feet, shackle them to the ground, remove the shirt, and they would take the inmate, lay him over the board of the half arc, and they would pull one of his arms down to the ground to shackle them to the ground to the point where they were almost dislocated at the shoulders. They went on to say that one of the main whips that was used was called a rat tail, about 3 feet long. It was sole leather. They also mentioned at one point they used what was called a cat nine, also made of sole leather. It was reported that the warden himself did most of the quote-unquote punishments, unless he had another officer assigned to do so. But the warden, whoever was doing the whipping, would take either one of those whips, whichever was being used, soak them in water, roll them in sand, and whip the individual, whip the inmate until either the warden or the other officer was tired, which left lacerations that were reported were open wounds up until a year after the initial beating. That's if they survived, because many actually died from the kicking jenny as well. So when they went on to, the interview went on with Wilkerson, and they asked him, well, how many died from this? And he reported, I cannot remember all the names. He did say a minimum of 2 inmates died per month for 2 years straight, just from the quote-unquote punishment/torture that Warden Peck was approving, allowing to happen. And so that puts you right around 48 deaths, according to Wilkerson's testimony, who again was against what was going on, which is why he quit and exposed what was going on. So the individual who was conducting the interview asked Wilkerson, well, what happened to all the bodies? And he replied, they buried them under the prison walls.
Wow, that is absolutely insane. I mean, to think that violent torture was being subjected upon the inmates, was being used to bring order to the penitentiary in a very gruesome way, and that when the inmates died, that instead of giving them a proper burial and taking ownership for what they had done, that they would just roll their bodies under the wall and bury them. I think, thinking about dark way to die, that probably is probably one of the darkest ways that I've actually heard of, since, like Steven mentioned, the Spanish Inquisition, and it even brings up different storybooks and the punishment of storybooks like Dante's Inferno and things like that. So it's really crazy.
Well, and just like Steve was mentioning with the kicking jenny, I believe that they would actually beat these inmates to the point where their backs, the skin would actually rip, like what they would describe as wet tissue paper. It would get so raw.
And I would imagine that those bodies are still there, right? Because, If they tried to dig them up, the walls would just collapse.
I believe he said under the walls, in the foundation. And what's interesting, if we think about it, one of the types of rock that is widely accepted as being a harbor, if you will, for energy is sandstone. The entire prison is constructed of sandstone. Not to mention every stone that makes up the walls, the admin building or whatever, interior, exterior wall, was cut by hand, laid by hand by prison labor. So many, many inmates laid hands upon every stone that was used to construct that prison. And then now you take at least 48 deaths that were painful, that were brutal deaths. And now they are permanently a part of that wall.
Well, and it's just like was mentioned earlier with the sandstone that the building is actually constructed out of. You think that the sandstone, how much quartz that it actually contains, and how many people believe how quartz may or may not have a certain amount of metaphysical properties to it, so to speak, which could perhaps retain some of these energies, some of these emotions from the years.
Yeah, I mean, the foundation of the prison is literally built on torture and death, so that should give you a kind of an insight as to how the place is and was.
Let's also not forget that the entire foundation, the entire land that this building is built on, is entirely Native American burial grounds, ancient, sacred Native American burial grounds, because Moundsville itself is named for the burial mounds that line the city, as well as the largest, the Grave Creek Mound, the mound that sits directly adjacent to the penitentiary. And it is a proven fact that they did uncover the remains of Native Americans as they were constructing this penitentiary. So the reasons for the hauntings from the very beginning of its history just start to add up. And we haven't even gotten into the inmate-on-inmate violence or the epidemics or the disease or the executions. And this is just the beginning. Yeah, we haven't even gotten into the 20th century yet. This is just the beginning. Once the facility was completed, moving into the 20th century almost, you talk about the culture of executions in the state of West Virginia. That's something that I think needs to be talked about, because it wasn't until 1897 that they passed a law that would seal the fate of the West Virginia Penitentiary as being the site of the execution of 94 men between 1899 and 1959. And it's important to point out that prior to that, all the executions in the state were public square executions that were done in the county in which the crime was committed. And the last time that happened was John Morgan. I believe it was in Ripley. Am I correct in that? Was that Ripley, West Virginia, that they actually performed that execution? So that actually happened, and it was supposedly a disgrace. Apparently the crowd made a mockery of this execution, and they ended up having to move the site of these executions inside the penitentiary. And that is when they built the infamous death house.
Well, like you say, the death house was actually constructed in 1899. It was a 2-story white wooden structure. The first floor housed the execution chamber and 4 semicircle cells, which was home for the death row inmates the last couple of days. The second floor would have housed the room for the guards, room for the chaplain, and an area to house inmates who had dangerous and contagious diseases, such as smallpox, tuberculosis, typhoid, things like that at the time. As you all know, of course, a lot of the inmates lost their lives at that time to TB, where that was so rampant in those early years.
Yeah, according to my grandmother's family history, I lost an uncle, Thomas Jennings, due to the plague there within the penitentiary. My other uncle actually was one of the only known successful escapes.
So it's probably pretty safe to say, Steve, that you had a family member that very well could have died as an inmate in the death house if they passed away from the plague. That could be considered a dangerous and infectious disease. Probably could have been quarantined away in the upper floor of the death house, and maybe he did pass away there.
It's a possibility. We're not quite sure exactly. I haven't seen exactly when he died. I know the ballpark time when, at one point, because they spent multiple visits, if you will, to the facility. They were bootleggers and train robbers and whatnot. But at one point they were there during the mid-1880s. I do know that. but they very well could have been there for another stint, later on down the line.
I mean, you talk about a building that was used for the sole purpose of death and executions, and that sure, the deadly and infectious diseases were quarantined away in the upper floors, but the first floor, that death chamber, that was used for no other reason other than for the executions. And there were 85 hangings and 9 men that died by the electric chair. Some of them notorious, some of them less than notorious, some of them with very dark stories. Now, there was an inmate that was executed in the death house in 1932 that I think Dave and Polly, Dave's mom, have a very close connection to. And Dave, talk a little bit about that man and what you know about him in general.
Well, that gentleman's name would be Harry Powers. He was from Clarksburg, or right outside of Clarksburg, which is where I grew up. He in a little town or village, if you will, called Quietdale. So basically, what his thing is that he was into like mail order brides. So he would put in advertisements in newspapers and magazines and things of that nature, trying to find wealthy single women to that he could court and eventually marry. And once he gained their trust, and basically his aim was to get a joint bank account so he could steal all of their money, kill them, and then go on to the next one. Now, the main reason he ended up in the West Virginia Penitentiary is he murdered a woman and her 3 kids and buried them in a ditch under his farmhouse. And eventually he got caught, and that's what got him sent to the penitentiary. In a nutshell.
Yeah, it's a really crazy story. He was executed on March the 18th of 1932 there at the penitentiary. And it was international news at the time when he was captured. The only thing that overshadowed that was the abduction of the Lindbergh baby in the early 1930s, which was a royal family. And that was why that made big news. So it really was probably one of the biggest stories of murder and death and corruption and of that time. And Harry Powers was executed. There were thousands of people in Moundsville that had shown up to watch the execution, hoping that they could get a glimpse of him hanging at the end of that noose. But that never really happened. He was executed. Only 42 people got to see it. And it was pretty much a quiet execution. But he was a very sick and twisted individual. I do remember that. I do remember hearing that about him. He wasn't the only person to be executed there, though. Remember, we don't want to take too much time on this death house, but 94 executions total, 85 by hanging and 9 by the electric chair. And that's just part of the 998 that died there.
Can we take a quick moment, if you guys want to mention our Patreon page?
Yeah, absolutely. Go for it, Dave.
Okay, if you guys would like to, you can pause the video, open up a new browser, and type in www.patreon, that's patreon.com/paranormal quest, and become a patron on our Patreon page. There's a bunch of different different rewards over there where you can actually have your name show up in the end slate and all of the future episodes if you want. And there's actually a reward on there there's only one, that somebody could actually obtain the very first digital recorder we used on Paranormal Quest. So go and check that out.
Well, what do you think? Do you think we should jump right back into it, or do you think we should take one question from our Facebook page?
What do you guys think? You want to take a question?
Sure.
Let's take a question.
So we'll take a question. If you have not followed us on Facebook, go to facebook.com/Our Paranormal Quest, and you can actually find these questions, or you can find where we post on the social media page, and we will see. So let's go ahead. Where within the building/buildings is the absolute most active?
Take a turn to answer here. I feel like we might have a different answer from each of us. And honestly, in the years that I personally have been going there, it actually has seemed to change over the years. And I don't really know why, but when I first started going there, it was the Sugar Shack, because you only had one entrance into the Sugar Shack. And now there are two where you just walk out of the lobby and down the stairs. But before, you used to have to go all the way underneath the gymnasium into the basement there, walk through that tunnel, and walk through that basement of tunnels, if you will, up to the Sugar Shack. And that gave it a very different vibe than it has now. Because once they opened up that other end, it kind of seemed like it just dissipated. Nowadays, I would probably personally have to go with the infirmary.
I'll go about it this way. If I could pick one area in that prison where I would have the most apprehension of going to, I guess, would have to be the new half of the prison's basement in general.
Okay. Oh, yeah.
In general.
Definitely.
There's things that have happened that I've seen, heard, down there during haunted house nights, during our investigations, just by working down there, that really, for me, just kind of surpasses a lot what's happened to me in the typical area that people get to go to.
Sure.
And if I had to pick an area other than that, that's on the general route of the general area of the prison for like the tourist side, maybe not so much as EVP per se, but just overall vibe of the place would have to be the new cafeteria.
Oh, yeah.
The kitchen.
That's a good one.
Personally, I would have to agree with you, Dave. For me, I would say the most active area of that old penitentiary would be the infirmary and or the psychiatric ward. Those areas seem to, the kind of things that happen up there are just, in my opinion, stranger than the things which happen in all the other areas of the prison over the 10 acres. I mean, obviously it would be hard pressed to actually pinpoint an exact hot spot inside that old prison. It's just so incredible.
Yeah, I can agree with that. I think the infirmary does have a lot of activity. I believe at one time, years ago, that probably would have been my answer, and probably up until recently it would have been my answer as one of the most active areas in the penitentiary, but I think it's shifted a little bit. I feel like I've had a little bit more apprehension recently in North Hall cell block, which is one of the oldest cell blocks in the penitentiary, and I think the activity there has really begun to spike as of recently. I've noticed a huge fluctuation and a huge spike in activity there, and I think out of all the places right now, I think that's the most active.
That's interesting, because when I first started going to the prison, that was the one place in the prison I wouldn't go to. My mom would often go with my Aunt Lucy, and I remember a lot of the times they would want to go down there, and I did not go down there. I did not like going down there. And then over the last few years, it didn't bother me at all, but I haven't been down there recently. That's interesting to know that it's starting to get that vibe again.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I mean, you look at the history of North Hall, and, when it was mainline population, the overcrowding and the death and the spread of diseases and the violence there. But really the last 9 years, that cell block was one of the most violent places in the penitentiary. And I think that really has influenced the activity and the energy of the cell block. And every once in a while, it'll begin to get that vibe again. And I think it started to really get that vibe as of recent. So we wanted to thank everybody for asking those questions on Facebook. We also just wanted to extend that we do have a Twitter page. Our Twitter handle is @PQReality. We also get questions on there, and we will be ending the show with a question on our Twitter page, so stay tuned for that. Right now, we are going to jump right back into this penitentiary, its history, and some of the hauntings that it holds, and some of our own personal stories from over the years, because there's a lot of it.
And that's absolutely right, Ryan. We do have a lot to go over still yet, even though we have been talking pretty lengthy so far, but hopefully everybody is enjoying this and continues to listen. So if you've listened this far, Milford the Squirrel, comment it.
Absolutely. Put that in the comment section, Milford the Squirrel, and we will have even more props to anyone who remembers what episode Milford the Squirrel made an appearance in. So
That's right.
If you can remember what episode that was from, put that in the comment section. No cheating now. And if you are that much of a PQ follower and you remember Milford the Squirrel, we will send you an autographed PQ picture. But yeah, absolutely. Let's go ahead and move into the penitentiary's history, because there's some areas that we would definitely love to talk to you about. A lot of the history. Now, one event comes to mind. Jason, you had mentioned the Riot night. That was a very major event. That was a major event that took place in the penitentiary on January 1st of 1986. Sent shockwaves through the West Virginia state prison system and through the West Virginia state government.
Well, it did. It was a monumental point in history, like you say, for the West Virginia Department of Corrections, and most importantly, the West Virginia State Penitentiary. On January 1st of 1986 is when this riot actually took off. It was always a New Year's tradition. A lot of the guards would call in sick, quote-unquote sick. 1986 was no different. A lot of the inmates were aware of this tradition. They seized their opportunity. They were terribly understaffed that particular evening. Made it a little bit easier for the 20-some original inmates to actually take over the prison to start the riot off. Again, it lasted approximately 52 hours. They took 16 hostages, 15 guards, and 1 food service worker. Throughout the course of the 52-hour riot, 3 inmates of the penitentiary were brutally murdered, and they were labeled as informants, or snitches, as they call them in prison. And so there was a lot of murders. There were a lot of rapes during that time. There were a lot of drug abuse during this riot. So again, you have to think of the conditions that they were living in, though. And that was really the main reason why they took over the prison, was the terrible living conditions that they were actually subjected to being housed in.
Yeah, and I think that event in and of itself, I mean, historically it's very well remembered because it wasn't that long ago that it happened. I mean, 1986, that was 32 years ago. So it really wasn't that long ago. It was in the lifetime of many people. Maybe some people that are listening remember when that took place. And it's very important to point out that I think events like that, especially the violent events where these types of things were happening, a lot of the death that took place, the murders, were particularly violent, and that could have left behind a mark, as well as some of the intelligent spirits of those that died during the riot. But again, residual energy is a big thing, and I think the penitentiary itself, all of the traumatic events and all of the dramatic events, so to speak, they definitely hold their own energy, and I think that energy replays itself, and people will, when you visit that place, there are times when you will feel that energy from the traumatic and dramatic events of this penitentiary's past replay itself. You just might go into a cell block and hear a disembodied voice or an EVP of a man screaming, "Yeehaw!" You never know when that type of stuff is going to happen, and this penitentiary is ripe with paranormal activity, and that's something that I think should not be taken for granted.
I think another piece of interesting history about the infirmary that I think a lot of people maybe don't realize, and I think might contribute to a lot of the activity up there, is that, where the infirmary is sitting is where the South Hall cell block used to be. And I think that would have probably been was it 4 tiers there? Yeah. So that would have been where the 4th tier would have been. And I think that adds to a lot of the residual or hauntings up in that area. What do you think?
There could have been untold number of things that happened, a number of deaths that have been lost to history and time that we don't really have readily available at our fingertips to recall, because it happened so long ago in a part of the prison that has been torn out.
I want to add, along with that, I think one of the another major catalyst for the energy, the residual, the intelligent energies there in the facility, primarily in the old half, the original prison, if you will, is when they would do the executions. Primarily, we'll talk about primarily when they were doing the executions by electrocution. Whenever the charges, if you will, were sent to the individual to execute the inmate, the lights within the prison would dim greatly. North Hall, if for those of you who have been through the prison or will go through the prison, you will notice there are only 186 cells left of North Hall. Originally, there were 600. Originally in South Hall, as they just talked about, there were 240. So that basically gives you 840 cells total of the original prison. So imagine anywhere from 900 to 1,200 inmates at any given time. Whenever those lights would dim during the execution by electrocution, whenever they would dim, you would hear that many inmates yelling and screaming with every charge. Every time those lights would dim, you'd hear a chorus of screams. You would hear cells rattling, doors, inmates banging on the doors on the cell walls, their bunks, and making as much noise and commotion as possible every time those lights would dim. And that was 3 times per inmate. That was 3 charges sent, ranging anywhere from, I heard anywhere from 800, 900 up to 1,400 volts on an average. That's a lot of energy displaced, not only to the inmate, but energy being displaced from the inmates into the atmosphere, onto cell walls, cell doors, the floor, just the atmosphere.
And the sandstone that we have already established, made of quartz, collects and harbors that energy and releases it back into the atmosphere. But it's interesting that you mentioned that, Steve, because it was a literal shockwave sent from the electric chair to the inmate, and it was a spiritual shockwave, an energy shockwave sent from the other inmates out into the atmosphere as they erupted in that form. And I think that's, again, it's events like that that add to the paranormal activity of the prison in ways that we don't even understand. Residual energy is hard to understand and hard to explain. And I think that locations like the former West Virginia Penitentiary, they're able to harbor that energy through these traumatic events, and I think that it really is a hotbed for that type of energy and activity.
And there's one more thing I forgot to add. I just remembered this. We talked about the stone that was there, the Native American burial ground, the violence, the death. One thing that lies even, if you will, lower, deeper than any of those are the underground streams that feed into the Ohio River. The now abandoned coal mines that have water running through them into the river. That's constant energy being created, generated, right below the walls, if you will, which is ironic. It's what they nicknamed it, was the walls. That's what the inmates would call it. That's constant energy. It's a constant energy source generating energy below what is already a charged 10-acre tract of land.
Yeah, it really is. And, on top of that, the energy, the residual energy, the violence, you had some very notable violent men that lived inside that building, men like Red Snyder, who lost their own lives, who were responsible for the death of anywhere between 5 to a dozen people inside the prison. No one really knows how many people Red Snyder actually either killed personally or had murdered. But then he himself lost his life and is believed to roam and haunt the halls of that prison. Inmates like Danny Spider Lehman, who was a head negotiator of that riot that Jason was talking about in 1986. He was a motorcycle club president, but he was a very, very respected inmate and a very talented artist in the prison. He lost his life there when 3 inmates attacked and murdered him by shoving a 12-inch long piece of steel through his eye socket. It was just a violent display. And a lot of the time that violence is left behind and can replay itself. And that's why I think the West Virginia Penitentiary, still to this day, is thought to be one of the most haunted locations in America. So that brings us to the end of this podcast here. And of course, that means that we are going to go back into picking the topic for next week. Again, you can either comment down below in the comment section what you want us to talk about next week based on these 2 options, or you can go like us on Facebook, look for the Facebook poll, and vote that way. And that is the most efficient way to have your vote heard, is by voting on that Facebook poll. So what do you think, Dave? What 2 options do we want to do for next week?
Well, what about, dreaming and astral projection?
Wow, yeah, that's a very interesting topic. I think there's so many people out there that are curious about that, and I think that might be a really good topic. And then, Jason, what do you think the second topic should be that they can choose from?
Well, we could always discuss our personal perspectives and beliefs behind the afterlife, what exactly it is, understanding the afterlife, understanding the concept of what comes after death.
That is a really good topic too. What do you guys think that are listening? Put it in the comment section. Would you rather hear about astral projection and dreams, or would you rather hear about understanding the afterlife? So put it down in the comment section, or go over to our Facebook page and vote on the poll that will be posted on our timeline, on our wall, over on the Paranormal Quest Facebook page. We want to thank everyone for listening to us. We want to thank everyone for discussing the former West Virginia Penitentiary. And we want to thank the West Virginia Penitentiary personally for all the fond memories, for all the stories, and for allowing us to speak on the topic here on this podcast. So if you have any questions for us, please comment below, and we will try and get to them in the next podcast. And thank you for tuning in to Feed Your Addiction. This has been the Ghost Addicts Podcast.